The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Grove Police Department's brick facade as Officer Ashley Cooper adjusted her badge in the locker room mirror. Her fellow officers called her the department's rising star behind her back, and truthfully, they weren't wrong. In just 5 years on the force, she'd racked up more commendations than most officers see in their entire careers. The small town of Cedar Grove wasn't exactly a hotbed of crime, but Ashley had an uncanny knack for being in the right place at the right time. Whether it was catching shoplifters at the local mall or breaking up domestic disputes before they turned violent, she seemed to have a sixth sense for trouble. Her arrest record was spotless, her paperwork immaculate, and her community outreach work had earned her glowing write-ups in the local newspaper. "Morning, superstar," called out Detective Thompson as Ashley walked into the briefing room. She gave him a friendly wave, settling into her usual seat near the front. The other officers respected her not just for her accomplishments, but for her willingness to help rookie cops learn the ropes. She'd mentor them through their first traffic stops, show them the best spots for radar patrol, and teach them how to deal with difficult civilians without losing their cool. Life at home seemed just as perfect. Her husband Michael, an FBI agent specializing in white-collar crime, had a reputation for being one of the sharpest minds in the bureau. They'd met at a law enforcement conference 3 years ago, and their wedding had been the talk of both departments. Their colonial-style house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and carefully tended garden, looked like something out of a magazine. At community events, they were the power couple everyone wanted to talk to. Ashley would share stories about her work with the town's youth outreach program, while Michael would fascinate listeners with carefully sanitized versions of his FBI cases. They hosted barbecues for their neighbors in summer and volunteered together at the local food bank during holidays. Everyone agreed they were the perfect example of law enforcement's finest. That morning, as Ashley sat through the daily briefing, she felt the comfortable weight of her service weapon at her hip and the cool metal of her wedding ring against her finger. Life felt solid, predictable, and entirely under control. She'd worked hard to build this reputation, this life, this perfect image. The chief was even hinting at a possible promotion to detective by year's end. But appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. Behind Ashley's picture-perfect smile and exemplary service record, something else was brewing. The same instincts that made her such an effective officer had led her down a path she'd never expected to travel. It started small, as these things often do. A favor here, a blind eye there, a piece of evidence that didn't quite make it into the official record. She'd gotten good at justifying it to herself. Sometimes the system needed a little help to ensure justice was served, right? Besides, she was still doing good work, still protecting her community. If some of her methods weren't exactly by the book, well, that was just the reality of modern policing. At least, that's what she told herself as she sat in that morning briefing, unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. What Ashley didn't know, as she confidently made her way through another seemingly ordinary day, was that her FBI husband had begun to notice things. Little inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite add up. And Michael, with his years of experience investigating complex cases, had learned long ago that sometimes the biggest mysteries start with the smallest clues. The sun continued to shine brightly over Cedar Grove that morning, but storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Ashley Cooper's perfect facade was about to face its greatest test, and the ripples from what was coming would change not just her life, but the entire town of Cedar Grove forever. Michael Peterson sat at his home office desk late one night, staring at his laptop screen. The soft glow illuminated the worry lines creasing his forehead. As an FBI agent, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and lately, those instincts had been screaming at him that something wasn't right with his wife Ashley. It started with the little things. A month ago, he'd noticed a deposit in their joint account that didn't match any of their regular income. When he casually mentioned it over dinner, Ashley had brushed it off as a bonus for extra shifts. But Michael knew the local police department's payment schedules. They didn't give random bonuses in the middle of the month. Then there were the phone calls. They always came late at night, and Ashley would step outside to take them, claiming they were work-related. 20 years in law enforcement had taught Michael that midnight calls usually meant trouble, not routine police business. He'd started keeping a small notebook, jotting down dates and times, trying to convince himself he wasn't really investigating his own wife. Just working on a case, he'd say whenever Ashley walked by his office and found him lost in thought. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was working on something, just not an official FBI case. Not yet, anyway. The changes in Ashley's behavior were subtle but unmistakable. The woman who once spent hours telling him about her community outreach work now changed the subject whenever he asked about her day. She'd become more distant, more guarded, especially when discussing certain arrests or operations. One evening, while sharing a takeout dinner, Ashley mentioned a drug bust she'd been part of. "Biggest haul this year," she'd said proudly. But when Michael looked up the case in the public records later that week, the numbers didn't match. The official report listed significantly less drugs seized than what Ashley had described. His heart grew heavier with each new discrepancy he uncovered. The Ashley he knew had always been passionate about doing things by the book. She'd been the one who insisted on reporting even the smallest policy violations. What had changed? The worst part was the way she handled suspects now. Michael had heard through his FBI contacts about complaints filed against her, excessive force, missing personal property, questionable searches. The complaints never stuck, of course. Ashley's record remained officially spotless, but that only made Michael more suspicious. Nobody had a perfect record in law enforcement, not really. One rainy Sunday afternoon, Michael found himself parked across from a local diner, watching through the window as Ashley met with Officer Reynolds, a colleague she'd claimed to barely know. But their body language told a different story. They were clearly familiar with each other, trading what looked like documents under the table. Michael's training kicked in automatically as he snapped a few discreet photos with his phone, hating himself for doing it even as he pressed the shutter button. That night, he couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan spun lazily above their bed as he listened to Ashley's steady breathing beside him. How had they gotten here? When had his role as a loving husband become tangled up with his duty as a federal agent? The weight of his suspicions felt like a physical presence in their bedroom, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Michael knew he should report his concerns to Internal Affairs. That's what any good FBI agent would do. But every time he reached for the phone, he remembered their wedding day, the way Ashley had looked at him as she promised to always be honest and true. Had those just been words to her? The next morning, as he watched Ashley get ready for work, pinning on the badge she'd once been so proud to wear, Michael made a decision. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Whatever was going on, he had to know the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything they built together. He waited until Ashley's patrol car disappeared around the corner before pulling out his secure FBI phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad as he thought about what this call would mean. Once he started down this path, there would be no turning back. Their life together, their reputation in the community, everything would change. But as he thought about the oath they'd both sworn to uphold the law, he knew he had no choice. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hand as he dialed the number for the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Sometimes, he realized, loving someone means being willing to lose them for the right reasons. The Joint Task Force operation was supposed to be routine. Local police and FBI working together to crack down on a string of business robberies in Cedar Grove. Michael sat in the command center, surrounded by monitors showing surveillance feeds from across the city. He'd been dreading this day, knowing Ashley would be involved in the operation, but he hadn't expected the truth to hit him quite so hard. The morning had started like any other joint operation. Teams were assigned, briefings were held, and everyone knew their roles. Michael kept his expression neutral as Ashley gave her portion of the briefing, explaining local patrol patterns with her usual confidence. If anyone noticed the tension between them, they didn't show it. As the operation unfolded, Michael monitored the feeds while coordinating with different teams. That's when he saw it, something that made his blood run cold. On one of the screens, Ashley's patrol car pulled up behind a local convenience store well outside her assigned sector. She wasn't alone. Officer Reynolds was there too, and what happened next confirmed Michael's worst fears. The store owner, Mr. Chen, came out the back door. There was no robbery in progress, no emergency call, just a quiet conversation that looked all too familiar to Michael's trained eye. Money changed hands, disappearing quickly into pockets. It was the same pattern he'd seen in countless corruption cases, but this time his wife was at the center of it. "Can we get a closer view of camera 4? Michael asked, keeping his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The tech operator zoomed in, and the evidence became irrefutable. Ashley was part of a protection racket, collecting payments from local businesses. The robberies they were investigating weren't random. They were targeted at shops that refused to pay up. His fingers flew across the keyboard, documenting everything. Each keystroke felt like a betrayal, but he couldn't stop. The pieces were finally falling into place, the unexplained deposits, the late-night calls, the complaints that never stuck. Ashley wasn't just looking the other way, she was actively participating in a criminal enterprise. The operation continued around him, but Michael's world had shrunk to the images on his screen. He watched as Ashley and Reynolds moved to another location, following the same pattern. The worst part was how professional they looked, how normal. To anyone else, it would appear they were just doing their jobs, checking on local businesses. "Sir," one of the junior agents touched his shoulder. "We're getting some unusual patterns in Sector 7. Should we redirect teams there?" Michael stared at the map, seeing the bigger picture emerge. Sector 7 was where most of the legitimate robbery investigations were centered, conveniently far from where Ashley and her associates operated. They'd been using the real crimes as cover for their own activities. During the lunch break, Michael slipped away to the evidence room. Years of FBI work had taught him how to move quietly, how to avoid being noticed. He found what he was looking for in the case files: incident reports with missing details, witness statements that had been altered, evidence logs that didn't quite match reality. Back at his desk, he started connecting the dots. The corruption went deeper than he'd imagined. It wasn't just Ashley and Reynolds, there was a whole network of officers involved. They had a system. Some collected payments, others handled evidence tampering, and a few were responsible for intimidating anyone who might talk. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him like a physical thing. He thought about their home, their life together, all built on what now felt like quicksand. Every commendation Ashley had received, every proud moment they'd shared, how much of it had been real? His phone buzzed. A text from Ashley. "Dinner at home tonight. I'm cooking your favorite." The normalcy of the message almost broke him. How could she act so normal while carrying such secrets? How long had she been living this double life? The Ashley he fell in love with had been passionate about justice, about doing what was right. When had that changed? As the day wore on, Michael methodically gathered and secured his evidence. Each new detail was another nail in the coffin of his marriage, but he couldn't stop. The oath he'd taken as an FBI agent demanded nothing less than the full truth. The sun was setting when he finally looked up from his work. The command center had emptied out, leaving him alone with his discoveries and decisions. Tomorrow, he would have to make the hardest choice of his career: turn over the evidence and watch his wife's world crumble, or become part of the corruption by staying silent. But tonight, he would go home. He would sit across from Ashley at their dinner table, eat the meal she prepared, and carry the burden of knowing that everything was about to change. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest crimes aren't committed with guns or violence, but with the slow erosion of trust and integrity. The next 2 weeks felt like walking through quicksand for Michael. Every morning, he'd kiss Ashley goodbye, watching her drive off to work in her patrol car, knowing that each piece of evidence he gathered was another step toward destroying their life together. The Internal Affairs Office had given him a secured phone for documenting everything, and its weight in his pocket felt like carrying a live grenade. Working with Internal Affairs wasn't easy. Detective Wilson, a veteran investigator with tired eyes and coffee-stained teeth, had been skeptical at first. "You sure about this?" he'd asked when Michael first brought him the evidence. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Michael had just nodded, unable to trust his voice. They set up a small command center in an abandoned office building across town. The space smelled of dust and old coffee, but it served their purpose. Maps covered the walls, showing patrol routes and business locations. Red pins marked known payoff spots, blue ones for suspected evidence tampering. The pattern was becoming clearer every day. One rainy Tuesday, Michael watched through binoculars as Ashley met with 3 other officers behind the old warehouse district. They were careful, professional. Anyone passing by would think it was just a routine meeting. But Michael's camera caught the exchange of envelopes, the quick nods, the practiced movements of people who'd done this many times before. "Your wife's good at this," Wilson commented, reviewing the footage later. "Never shows anything on her face. Keeps her distance from the money until the last possible moment." The words hit Michael like physical blows, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't about his feelings anymore. The investigation revealed layers of corruption that stunned even the veteran investigators. It wasn't just protection money and evidence tampering. The network had fingers in everything: drug seizures that never made it to evidence, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, case files that mysteriously disappeared. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy at home. Ashley would talk about her day over dinner, and Michael had to listen, knowing the real story behind her carefully edited versions. "Rough day today," she'd say. "Had to deal with some troublemakers at the shopping center." What she didn't mention was how those troublemakers were actually business owners who'd refused to pay protection money. One night, as they watched TV together, Ashley's phone buzzed. Michael pretended to be absorbed in the show, but he noticed how she angled the screen away from him, how her fingers moved quickly over the keys. Another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of their marriage. The investigation team grew as they uncovered more connections. Officer Reynolds wasn't just Ashley's partner in collecting payments, he was the link to a larger network that stretched into neighboring districts. They found offshore accounts, shell companies, a whole system designed to hide the money trail. Michael spent hours in that dusty command center, piecing together surveillance photos, financial records, and witness statements. Each new discovery felt like a punch to the gut. The Ashley he knew, or thought he knew, had been passionate about helping people. When had she crossed that line? How has she justified it to herself? The turning point came when they discovered the recordings. A local business owner, tired of paying protection money, had secretly recorded conversations with the corrupt officers. The tapes revealed not just the demands for money, but threats against families, against livelihoods. It was organized crime wearing a police badge. "We've got enough," Wilson said one evening, looking at the wall of evidence. "More than enough." Michael nodded, staring at a photo of Ashley from their wedding day that he kept in his wallet. She was smiling at the camera, young and idealistic in her dress whites. That woman felt like a stranger now. The final piece fell into place when they tracked down a former officer who'd tried to blow the whistle years ago. He'd been forced to resign, his reputation ruined. But he had kept records, dates, names, amounts. Everything matched what they'd uncovered. That night, Michael sat alone in their backyard, looking at the stars. Tomorrow, they would start making arrests. The carefully built case would become public, and nothing would ever be the same. He thought about the oath he'd taken as an FBI agent, about justice and duty and truth. Sometimes doing the right thing felt an awful lot like betrayal. Inside, he could hear Ashley on the phone, probably with her fellow officers, planning tomorrow's activities. She had no idea that her world was about to implode. Michael took out his secure phone one last time, sending the signal that would set everything in motion. The time for investigation was over. Tomorrow, justice would be served, and the cost would be measured in broken lives and shattered trust. Dawn broke over Cedar Grove with a cold, gray light. Michael hadn't slept all night, watching Ashley's peaceful breathing beside him, knowing it would be the last morning they'd wake up together. His FBI raid jacket felt heavy as he put it on in the garage, careful not to make any noise. The weight of his bulletproof vest seemed to press against his heart. The operation was set for 9 a.m., when the morning shift would be fully staffed at the police station. Michael arrived at the command post at 6, joining 24 FBI agents and trusted state police officers. Detective Wilson from Internal Affairs was already there, his face grim as he handed out final assignments. "Remember," Michael addressed the team, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "These are trained officers we're dealing with. They know our tactics, our procedures. We do this by the book." He didn't mention that one of those officers was his wife. Everyone in the room already knew. The minutes ticked by like hours. Michael watched through binoculars as Ashley arrived at the station, carrying her usual travel mug of coffee. She had kissed him goodbye this morning, telling him she'd make his favorite lasagna for dinner. The memory now felt like a knife in his chest. At exactly 9 a.m., the operation launched. FBI vehicles converged on the station from all directions. State police helicopters appeared overhead. Michael led the main entry team, his heart pounding as they approached the front doors. The element of surprise was critical. They couldn't risk anyone destroying evidence. The look on Ashley's face when the FBI team burst into the squad room would haunt Michael forever. She was at her desk, halfway through a report. Their eyes met across the room. In that moment, he saw everything: shock, betrayal, understanding, and finally, a deep, burning anger. FBI. Everyone stay at your desks. Hands where we can see them. The commands echoed through the station. Most officers complied immediately, stunned by the sudden invasion. Officer Reynolds made a move toward his desk drawer, but stopped when 3 agents trained their weapons on him. Michael moved through the chaos with mechanical precision, focusing on procedure to keep his emotions in check. He watched as Ashley was read her rights, saw her hands being cuffed behind her back. She hadn't said a word, hadn't broken eye contact with him once. "You could have talked to me," she finally said as an agent began to lead her away. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. "After everything we've been through, you could have given me that much." "Like you talked to me," Michael replied, equally soft. "About the payoffs? The threats? The evidence tampering?" Each question seemed to hit her like a physical blow, but he couldn't stop. "I watched you, Ashley. For weeks, I saw everything." The station had become a crime scene. Agents moved from desk to desk, securing computers and files. Some officers were being led out in handcuffs, while others sat in shock, watching their colleagues' arrests. The chief was already in custody, his face ashen as he was escorted to a waiting vehicle. Local news crews had begun gathering outside, drawn by the fleet of FBI vehicles and the helicopters. Michael knew the story would explode across national media by nightfall. A corrupt police department brought down by an FBI agent who arrested his own wife. It was the kind of story that would grab headlines for weeks. In a small interview room, Michael watched through one-way glass as Ashley sat alone, still in her uniform. She looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. But when Detective Wilson began the interrogation, her training kicked in. She sat straight, answered questions with no comment, requested her lawyer. The evidence processing took hours. Teams found more than they'd expected: hidden files, burner phones, detailed records of payoffs. It seemed that once the corruption had taken root, it had spread like a cancer through the department. Even officers not directly involved had looked the other way, becoming complicit through their silence. As the day wore on, Michael found himself in his office, staring at their wedding photo on his desk. Ashley was smiling in her dress uniform, his arm around her waist. They'd been so happy, so full of plans for the future. How had it come to this? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Detective Wilson stood in the doorway, his face sympathetic. "We're moving them to county," he said. "Do you want to?" He left the question hanging. Michael shook his head. He'd done his duty, upheld his oath. The rest would be up to the courts. As he watched the transport vehicles pulled away from the station, he felt hollow inside. Today, justice had been served, but the price had been his heart. That night, alone in their house, Michael boxed up Ashley's things, each item a memory he couldn't bear to face. Tomorrow, the media circus would begin. There would be questions, interviews, endless scrutiny of their life together. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, he allowed himself to mourn what he'd lost while knowing he'd done what was right. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity on the first day of the trial. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Michael straightened his tie as he walked up the granite steps, cameras clicking in his direction. After 3 months of preparation, the moment of truth had arrived. Inside the courtroom, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on everyone present. The prosecution had arranged the evidence meticulously. Boxes of documents, hard drives, surveillance footage, all carefully labeled and organized. Michael sat in the front row, watching as Ashley and her co-defendants were let in, all wearing prison orange instead of their familiar police blues. The prosecutor's opening statement painted a clear picture. "This isn't just about corrupt officers," she told the jury. This is about a betrayal of public trust, about people who wore badges and swore oaths, then used their power to create a criminal enterprise right under our noses. Day after day, the evidence mounted. Business owners took the stand, their voices shaking as they described the protection racket. They said they couldn't guarantee our safety if we didn't pay, one elderly shop owner testified. Coming from the police, what were we supposed to do? Former officers who'd agreed to testify described how the corruption had spread through the department. It started small, looking the other way for certain crimes, accepting thank you gifts from grateful citizens. Then it grew into something darker, more organized. The money got bigger, the threats more serious, the consequences more severe for anyone who questioned the system. Michael's testimony came during the second week. He walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like lead, took the oath with a steady voice that surprised him. Ashley's eyes burned into him as he described the investigation, how he discovered her involvement, the evidence he'd gathered. His words echoed in the silent courtroom. "Did you have any prior suspicion of your wife's illegal activities?" The prosecutor asked. "No," Michael answered, his voice clear. "I believed in her completely. She was everything I thought a police officer should be." The defense tried to paint him as a betrayed husband acting out of spite, but the evidence was too solid. Financial records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing through offshore accounts. Surveillance footage captured countless illegal transactions. Text messages and emails revealed the extent of the conspiracy. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Every day brought new revelations, new depths to the corruption. The media called it the badges and betrayal case. News channels ran special reports about police corruption, using Cedar Grove as their prime example. Michael avoided the coverage, focusing instead on his testimony and supporting other witnesses. Ashley's lawyer tried to argue that she was just following orders, caught up in a system she didn't create. But the evidence told a different story. She'd been an active participant, one of the organizers who helped expand the operation. Her perfect record, it turned out, had been carefully manufactured through years of evidence, tampering, and witness intimidation. The jury deliberated for just 2 days. When they filed back into the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Michael held his breath as the verdicts were read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Count after count, defendant after defendant. The corruption ring that had gripped Cedar Grove for years was finally being dismantled in front of his eyes. Ashley showed no emotion as she was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Some of her co-defendants got more, some less, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation. The judge's words were harsh, emphasizing the special responsibility police officers hold and the severity of betraying that trust. After the sentencing, Michael found himself alone in the courthouse hallway. The marble floors echoed with departing footsteps as reporters rushed to file their stories. A court officer approached him with a small box, Ashley's personal effects that she'd been wearing when arrested. Her wedding ring was among them, still shining under the fluorescent lights. That evening, the local news ran special coverage of the verdicts. They interviewed community members who expressed shock, anger, and relief. Business owners spoke about feeling free from fear for the first time in years. The mayor announced plans for a complete overhaul of the police department, promising transparency and accountability. Michael watched none of it. Instead, he sat in his home office, looking at the commendations and photos he'd taken down weeks ago. Each one represented a moment he'd been proud of, a time when he thought they were both serving justice. Now those memories were tainted, colored by the knowledge of what had really been happening. The phone rang, his FBI supervisor offering congratulations on the successful prosecution. "You did the right thing," his boss said. "It couldn't have been easy, but you upheld your oath." Michael thanked him and hung up, staring out the window at the setting sun. Tomorrow, the papers would run their headlines about justice being served. But tonight, in the quiet of his empty house, Michael understood that sometimes justice comes at a price that no one is really prepared to pay. 1 year after the trial, Michael stood at the podium in the FBI Academy's main lecture hall. 300 fresh-faced trainees looked back at him, notebooks ready, eager to learn. The story of Cedar Grove had become a mandatory case study in police corruption, and Michael had become its reluctant teacher. "I'm not here to tell you a story about dirty cops," he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "I'm here to talk about choices. about the small decisions that lead us down paths we never thought we'd travel. The room was silent, every trainee hanging on his words. These lectures weren't easy for him. Each time, he had to relive those moments, the discovery, the investigation, the arrest. But he'd learned that sharing his experience helped others understand the real cost of corruption. It wasn't just about money or power, it was about trust, integrity, and the very foundation of law enforcement. Between teaching assignments, Michael had thrown himself into police reform work. He'd helped develop new training programs, advised departments on anti-corruption measures, and worked with community leaders to rebuild trust. The pain of what happened in Cedar Grove had become fuel for positive change. The letters from Ashley arrived every few months. At first, he'd left them unopened, but eventually he started reading them. She wrote about her life in prison, about the counseling sessions that helped her understand how she'd lost her way. There was no asking for forgiveness, just acknowledgement of what she'd done and the consequences of her choices. One sunny afternoon, Michael visited Mr. Chen's convenience store, the same one where he'd first spotted Ashley collecting protection money. The old shopkeeper had become something of a friend, a reminder of why the investigation had been necessary. "Business is better now," Mr. Chen told him, offering a cup of coffee. "No more special payments. Just honest work, honest profit." His smile spoke volumes about the impact of cleaning up the department. The new Cedar Grove police chief had asked Michael to consult on rebuilding the department. It was a challenging process. Hiring new officers, implementing strict oversight measures, rebuilding community trust. But slowly things were changing. The department now had civilian oversight committees, body camera requirements, and regular audits of all police operations. Michael's home office had changed too. Where photos of him and Ashley once stood, there were now thank you letters from business owners, certificates from anti-corruption programs, and pictures of graduating classes he taught. Life hadn't stopped. It had just taken a different direction. One evening, after a particularly intense lecture session, a young trainee approached him. "Sir," she said, "how do you know if you're making the right choice? When it's someone close to you." Michael thought carefully before answering. "You look at your oath," he said finally. "Not just the words, but what they mean. We serve justice, not people, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." The media eventually moved on to other stories, but Cedar Grove's transformation became a model for other departments. Journalists and researchers came to study how a corrupt system had been dismantled and rebuilt. Michael's case was cited in police academy textbooks across the country. Sometimes, late at night, he still looked at their wedding photo. Ashley's smile, frozen in time, reminded him of happier days. But he'd learned to live with his choices, to understand that love and duty don't always point in the same direction. During one of his reform workshops, a veteran officer asked him if he regretted his decision to investigate his wife. The room grew quiet, waiting for his answer. Michael looked around at the faces watching him, officers, trainees, community leaders, all trying to understand the human cost of upholding the law. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that she made choices that forced my hand. But I don't regret doing what was right, because at the end of the day, the badge isn't about power, it's about responsibility." As another year passed, Michael found unexpected peace in his new role. He'd moved to a smaller house, adopted a dog from the local shelter, and focused on making a difference in ways he hadn't imagined before. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something productive. His last letter to Ashley remained unsent on his desk. In it, he'd written about forgiveness, not the kind that erases consequences, but the kind that allows people to move forward. Maybe someday he'd send it. For now, he focused on teaching others that integrity isn't just about following rules, it's about making hard choices when the easy path feels so tempting. The sun set over Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across streets that felt cleaner somehow. In parks and shops, people went about their lives, no longer living under the shadow of corrupted authority. It wasn't a perfect ending. Real life rarely has those. But it was an honest one, and sometimes that's the best kind of justice there is.